Have you ever imagined being pulled over by the police for no legitimate reason? What if the very people sworn to uphold the law abused their power and treated you unfairly? Ethan Carter, a composed and sharp-minded 50-year-old man, had just wrapped up a long day at work. As the newly appointed police chief of a small Texas town, he was on his way home, looking forward to a quiet dinner with his family. But just as he turned onto a peaceful street, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, a signal to pull over. Ethan quickly checked his speed, 30 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. No violations, no broken taillights, no reason to be stopped. But he knew better than anyone that in situations like this, the truth often takes a backseat to prejudice. Taking a deep breath, Ethan followed the exact protocol he had taught his officers, hands on the wheel. Slow movements, a calm and measured tone when responding. Yet, as a harsh flashlight beam swept across his face, suspicion was already thick in the officer's voice. In a hurry to get somewhere, aren't you? From that tone alone, Ethan knew this wasn't a routine stop. Things were about to take a turn for the worse, and he had to be ready. Ethan Carter remained calm, locking eyes with the officer in front of him. With years of experience in law enforcement, he knew their demeanor was no accident. They weren't just checking his documents, they were searching for a reason to turn him into a suspect. "No, officer, I'm just on my way home," Ethan replied evenly. The officer didn't seem satisfied. He kept the flashlight on Ethan's face longer than necessary before shifting it down to scan the dashboard. Behind him, a larger officer hovered near his gun, a needless gesture toward someone fully cooperating. "License and registration," the first officer ordered, without a hint of courtesy. Ethan nodded, moving deliberately as he spoke. "I'm reaching for my registration in the glove compartment first. Then my wallet." Despite following every protocol, he could feel the tension rising. This wasn't a routine stop, it was a test of whether he would be submissive enough. As he handed over his documents, he asked, "May I ask why I was pulled over?" "You were driving recklessly. Almost swerved into the next lane." The officer replied instantly. A blatant lie. Ethan knew he had been driving carefully, and he had dashcam footage to prove it. "With all due respect, I don't believe that's accurate. My dashcam can verify." Instead of checking the evidence, the officer smirked. "Dashcam, huh? Good. We'll confiscate it as evidence." Ethan felt the situation slipping out of control. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his tone now openly hostile. "I'm fully cooperating. I have the right to know." "I said get out, now." Before Ethan could finish his sentence, the second officer lunged forward, grabbing his arm and yanking him out of the car as if he were a dangerous suspect. The cold bite of metal tightened around his wrists. The handcuffs locked. Resisting an officer. "Huh? Go ahead. Keep going. I'd love to add more charges." Ethan took a deep breath. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was blatant abuse of power. As he was shoved into the backseat of the patrol car, he caught a glimpse through the window. A few neighbors stood at a distance, peeking through their curtains. No one intervened. No one stepped forward. Ethan clenched his fists. They had no idea they had just arrested the wrong man, and he wasn't going to let this slide. The patrol car rolled forward, its tires humming against the pavement as streetlights cast fleeting shadows across Ethan Carter's calm face. Arrested without cause, handcuffed for refusing to submit blindly. He gazed out the window, realizing this wasn't just about him. This was a glaring symptom of a system rotting from within. Up front, the two officers sat casually, chatting as if they had just wrapped up a successful bust. They had no idea the colossal mistake they had just made. The younger officer, Daniels, glanced at Ethan through the rearview mirror, his tone laced with mockery. "So, tell me, who are you? A nighttime hustler or just another guy looking to mess with the cops?" Ethan met his gaze through the mirror, his voice steady but sharp. "I'm just a man trying to get home." The older officer, Reed, let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, we hear that all the time. Don't worry, we'll find something." Ethan stayed silent. He knew men like them. Men who believed that a uniform granted them unchecked power. When they arrived at the station, the harsh glow of fluorescent lights bathed the holding area in an eerie pallor. Daniels unlocked the cuffs and shoved Ethan toward the holding cell, smirking. "Welcome to your new home. Get comfortable, you'll be here for a while." Ethan rubbed his wrists, feeling the cold indentations left by the metal. He had witnessed injustice like this before, but this time, he was the one sitting in the cell. Outside, Daniels and Reed leaned back at their desks, reviewing Ethan's vehicle registration. Nothing suspicious. Daniels muttered, sounding disappointed. Doesn't matter. Reed smirked. Guys like him always have something to hide. We'll keep him here long enough, something will turn up. Ethan heard every word. They didn't need a reason to hold him, just the power to do it. As other officers passed by, some cast curious glances at the cell. No one recognized him. He had only been the city's newly appointed police chief for less than a month. And now, he sat behind bars in his own station, as if he were a criminal. Time crawled. Ethan remained still, fingers interlocked, mind working. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. Then, the door swung open. A higher-ranking officer stepped in. Ethan lifted his gaze. The real storm was about to begin. The holding cell door swung open, and a woman stepped inside. Lieutenant Harper, tall, sharp-eyed, exuding the authority of someone who couldn't be easily manipulated. She flipped through the file in her hands, scanning the details before locking eyes with Ethan. What exactly is going on here? Her voice was cold, edged with suspicion. Daniels quickly stepped forward, trying to mask his unease. We arrested him for reckless driving and resisting. Harper turned her gaze to Ethan, assessing him, but he didn't need to explain himself. Instead, he simply said, I have a dashcam. It will show you exactly what I did, or rather, what I didn't do. Harper's brow furrowed. She had seen enough questionable arrests to recognize when something didn't add up. Have either of you reviewed the footage? Daniels and Reed exchanged a brief glance. Reed shrugged, feigning indifference. Haven't had time yet. Harper let out a short, humorless laugh, but her eyes gleamed with the sharpness of someone who had witnessed too many abuses of power. Then I suggest you make time. Now. She turned sharply and ordered. Retrieve his dashcam. I want to see it immediately. Reed clenched his jaw, but he had no choice. Another officer quickly retrieved the device. As the footage played, the entire room's atmosphere shifted. On screen, Ethan drove perfectly within the law. No reckless swerving, no violations. Then, the patrol car's dashcam footage followed, clearly showing Daniels and Reed pulling him over without justification. Silence hung heavy in the room. Harper folded her arms, her voice ice cold. So this is the reckless driving you mentioned? Daniels wiped sweat from his brow. Reed tried to maintain his composure, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Harper continued, her tone razor sharp. And this is resisting arrest. Because all I see is a man following protocol while two officers don't. Ethan watched them carefully. The balance of power had shifted. Harper turned to Daniels and Reed, her stare cutting through them. Both of you, my office. Now. As they exited, Harper turned back to Ethan. For the first time, there was a flicker of respect in her eyes. I'm guessing you're not just an ordinary man. Ethan gave a small, knowing smile. I'm the new police chief of this city. Harper stiffened for a moment before slowly nodding. Then I suppose we have a lot to discuss. Ethan stood, adjusting his sleeves. The game was over. Now, it was time to seek justice. News of Ethan Carter's wrongful arrest spread like wildfire. A police chief, arrested by his own subordinates for a crime that didn't exist? The story was too explosive to be swept under the rug. The trial followed swiftly. The courtroom was packed, not just with Ethan's colleagues but also journalists, city officials, and outraged citizens who had grown tired of police abuse. Ethan sat calmly at the defendant's table. Beside him, his attorney, Sophia Martinez, a sharp-minded woman with nerves of steel, methodically flipped through her files. Across the room, Daniels and Reed sat with their lawyer. Daniels fidgeted, his leg bouncing restlessly under the table, while Reed tried to appear composed, but the sweat on his forehead told a different story. The judge struck the gavel. We are here today to review the charges against Mr. Ethan Carter. Prosecution, you may proceed. The prosecutor stood, his voice hesitant. Your Honor, the defendant was arrested for reckless driving, nearly colliding with another vehicle, and resisting lawful orders from the officers. Sophia smirked, leaning toward Ethan and whispering, they just walked right into the trap. When it was her turn, she rose gracefully, her piercing gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Your Honor, These allegations are not just baseless, they expose a deep-rooted issue of abuse of power and racial profiling. And I intend to prove that right now. She signaled to the court clerk, who began playing Ethan's dashcam footage. Silence fell. The video clearly showed Ethan driving within the speed limit, obeying every traffic law. Next, footage from the patrol car played, showing Daniels and Reed pulling him over without justification. But the real bombshell came from Daniels' bodycam footage. A voice echoed through the courtroom. "Here comes another one of them," Daniels muttered as he approached Ethan's car. "Yep," Reed sneered. "Looks like we've got ourselves another troublemaker." A wave of murmurs and gasps rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor paled. The judge's frown deepened. Daniels went white as a sheet. Even Reed, who had remained smug until now, looked visibly shaken. Sophia paused the video and turned to the jury, her voice cold and unwavering. "Your Honor, this was not a lawful arrest. This was abuse. This was prejudice. This was a blatant violation of human rights." She then turned her attention to the two officers, her expression like ice. "And now, they will face the consequences." The judge slammed his gavel. "I want an explanation from these officers immediately." Reed bowed his head. Daniels, for the first time, was speechless. They both knew it was over. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Ethan slowly rose from his seat, adjusting his tie. When he spoke, his voice was calm, yet commanding. "My name is Ethan Carter. I am the police chief of this city." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, reporters scribbling furiously. Daniels and Reed looked as if they had been struck by lightning. Ethan turned to them, his gaze steady, his words heavy with authority. "I have spent my entire career fighting for justice, and I will not allow men like you to destroy it." The courtroom still trembled with shock after Ethan's revelation. No one could believe that the two officers who had abused their power had unknowingly arrested their own police chief. Daniels sat frozen, his face as pale as a sheet. Reed, once arrogant and smug, now looked like a broken man, unable to utter a single word. They knew their careers had ended the moment Ethan spoke. The judge cleared his throat and struck the gavel. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds Ethan Carter not guilty. Applause erupted throughout the room. The prosecutor, out of options, was forced to admit that the arrest had been unlawful. But for Ethan, this was not the end, only the beginning. The aftermath and a call for change. Within hours, news of the trial spread across the city. The footage of the wrongful arrest was released, igniting public outrage like never before. Daniels and Reed were immediately suspended and placed under an internal investigation. Protests erupted across the city, with citizens demanding transparency and police reform. The media dug deeper, exposing more cases of misconduct within the department. Ethan refused to let this moment go to waste. He called an emergency meeting with his entire police force, standing before hundreds of officers. His voice was firm and unyielding. "What happened to me is not an isolated case. It reflects a much bigger problem, and I will not tolerate it." His piercing gaze swept across the room. "If any of you believe that your badge gives you the right to abuse the people you swore to protect, then leave this force right now. I will not shield anyone." Silence fell. His message was clear: either change, or get out. A new hope. In the months that followed, major reforms were enacted. Mandatory training on racial bias and ethical policing. A transparent oversight system to hold officers accountable. Stricter disciplinary policies for misconduct. Change didn't happen overnight, but Ethan had sparked a real revolution within the police force. One evening, at a community meeting, a young man stood up, his voice filled with emotion. "Chief Carter, what happened to you could have happened to me, or any of us. Thank you for not staying silent." Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting both determination and hope. Change takes time, but if we keep fighting for it, justice won't just be a promise, it will become a reality. As Ethan Carter walked out of the courthouse that day, he knew this was more than just a personal victory, it was a turning point in the fight against abuse of power. His case was neither the first nor the last, but it had become a wake-up call for the entire city. Men like Daniels and Reed had operated unchecked for too long, and now, they were finally facing the consequences. But Ethan wasn't naive. He understood that reforming a broken system wouldn't happen overnight. Justice wasn't something that simply existed, it had to be fought for. As police chief, he vowed to enact real reforms, remove corrupt officers, and rebuild trust within the community. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. At a community gathering, a middle-aged man stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "I used to teach my kids to fear the police. But today, you've given me hope that things can change." Ethan looked around the room, faces filled with hope, determination, and a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the battle was far from over, but he was ready for it. Because if we don't stand up against injustice, then who will?